All right, please take a seat and direct your attention to the stage. So I just like to very briefly welcome you to our evening event, ticking how people-centered transitional justice can contribute to sustainable peace beyond box ticking. And I'm glad that this evening event will be officially opened by Andrew Gilmour, the director of the Berghof Foundation, and I'm glad to invite you, on side of the stage. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and delighted to welcome you. For those who are just joining us, this is the end of a two-day practitioners event on people-centered transitional justice, which has been jointly organized by the members of the Global Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. And our special thanks to the Robert Bosch Stiftung, who are our frequent collaborators and our hosts tonight, and also for BNZ, and Niels Annen in particular, for the very generous and great support we often get. So we initiated this Global Hub a year ago, and I'm very encouraged to see the fruits of that collaboration. I mean, and there were always three aims behind the Global Hub. The first was to achieve a space for dialogue and mutual learning amongst practitioners around the world, and I'm very glad that today is clearly an example of that. The second was to build bridges between, on the one hand, German institutions and organizations from the Global South, between those involved in policy or in research or in practice, and then thirdly, between different policy communities. And then the third aim was perhaps to generate practice-oriented knowledge to inform current and future peace processes and to create common ground for practical, not theoretical, recommendations on how to deal with the legacy of past serious violations and violence and to prevent recurrence. Now, I started a rather long stint at the UN 34 years ago, just coincidentally, the very week the Berlin Wall came down. And I think that was one of the events that makes Berlin such an appropriate place to have events to discuss transitional justice and dealing with the past more generally, which is a field of activity I'm convinced Germany is the undisputed world leader of in looking at the past. And about 2 or 3 years later, I was working with the then Secretary General's office, Boutros Ghali, on what was the agenda for peace, written in a sort of optimistic period, if not quite the end of history. At least it was the end of the Cold War, before a series of massive debacles struck the UN in Somalia, in Bosnia, and Rwanda. 31 years later, the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been asked to work on a new agenda for peace in very different circumstances. And I very much hope, I trust, that TJ will play a role in that. Because what it does, certainly for me, it links human rights, sustainable development, governance, and peace building. Now, human rights and so mediation or peace building, which were more political activities, have so much in common, and yet the practitioners of both spend so much time fighting one another, and sometimes pretty roughly. And I mean, one sees the other as sort of cynical narcissists, as human rights people often see those involved in mediation. And conversely, those involved in mediation see human rights people as unbearably moralistic and politically totally tone-deaf. Now, I do know what I'm talking about there because I spent a fair amount of time working in both those fields, and I'm afraid I participated in the general denigration of the other, whichever I was on. But as a repentant sinner, I'm very happy to announce that next month the Berghof Foundation is publishing a rather important book, I believe, on human rights and mediation, which the whole point of which is to show how they are complementary and how actually human rights isn't just a complication for peace building and mediation, but it actually is a very important asset for it. Thus, transitional justice has a very important role to play in bringing those fields together, and also sustainable development as well, and which is why the main development partners such as BMZ are so interested in it. Now seems to be a particularly important time to be discussing transitional justice, because in the past couple of years, of course, we have seen terrible new wars and unspeakable atrocities in Ukraine and Ethiopia, and we fear the worst in Sudan, which of course is no stranger to crimes against humanity and even genocide, as well as ongoing war crimes in Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Sahel, Myanmar. The list is all too long. And yet, paradoxically, just as war and war crimes continue and intensify, there seems a danger that the funds devoted to peace and transitional justice could be reduced. Now, there are some who believed that this country's Zeitenwende is in some ways a contrary to peace and transitional justice. Now, I take precisely the opposite view. Indeed, without a Zeitenwende, which for those who aren't living in Germany, it was a policy formulated by Chancellor Scholz after the Russian invasion, but it is now just a shorthand, usually just used in shorthand for increased military expenditure and investment. But without that, it is, in my view, just completely impossible to expect that there can be any accountability or any form of justice, traditional or transitional or otherwise, let alone an outcome that could produce reconciliation for the tens of thousands and probably, I fear, hundreds of thousands soon, victims of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And let's face it, in many of the instances where there have been important initiatives undertaken for international or national justice and transitional or normal justice, it was achieved because the perpetrators of massive human rights violations, war crimes and crimes against humanity, were removed from power after being weakened by military defeat. And such as obviously the defendants at the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, the Khmer Rouge, the Rwandan genocidaire, the Argentinian military dictatorship was weakened after losing the Malvinas, Falklands War, President Milosevic of Serbia, Habré of Chad, Taylor of Liberia, Jammeh of Gambia, all of them, it was military power that actually removed the perpetrators from office. And South Africa is perhaps an exception to that. But very often, in some ways, counterintuitive though it may be, military power is a precondition. The use of some form of military is a precondition. So while in no way do I believe that a Zeitenwende is incompatible with transitional justice, it is also the case that the Zeitenwende, if it's to be successful, has to be accompanied by a similar, if much smaller, investment in peace and justice. I mean, no one is talking about 100 billion euros for TJ and peace building, but even 1% of that figure would be a game changer on a global scale. Peace building is a very complex and long-term investment. Rebuilding destroyed infrastructure and homes is arduous enough as it is, but rebuilding truth, achieving restitution for abominable crimes, and healing relationships and finding the truth and achieving some form of reconciliation, these require profound changes on many levels, and shortcuts are rarely, if ever, possible. So I know that the practitioners over the last 2 days conference has been exploring the questions of how far has transitional justice succeeded in bringing about profound change, what kind of change is envisaged and by whom, and what brings success and what are the remaining challenges. And those were the aims, and I can honestly say I've been given no spoiler alert as to what is the outcome, which is why I'm particularly looking forward to sitting down and hearing from those of you who do know, and handing the floor to you, Hannah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and already also again touching it or bringing in a new perspective with respect to Zeitenwende and how to invest in peace building, so which is already probably also a relevant discussion which we haven't covered yet so far, I would say. Yeah, as you all see, and you have mentioned it, we are all entering here now a room where practitioners for the last 2 days have worked intensely. Many of you are here, have worked intensely on the field of transitional justice and many questions around it. And for this evening event also we have invited additional participants coming from ministries, from think tanks, from international organizations, and from the larger peace-building community, so that now some faces are familiar to those who were sharing this room for the last 2 days, and some faces will be new. And the whole event is about bridge making, bridge building, so that's why we are also coming together this evening. So can I please have an overview of the program, just to give you a quick orientation. Now I have to turn my head because the screen is gone. So we are having basically 3 parts. One will be, we have a dialogue here with so-called participants, ambassadors, who were participating in the conference the last 2 days and who will share some of their insights. This will be part 1. The second part will be then here a policy practitioners dialogue on stage. And I'm very glad that we're having high-level participants among us who will join us for this practitioners policy dialogue, where we want to, again, also to build the bridges between the different levels, between the local perspective and the government perspective, the international perspective, and see how people-centered approaches can make significant changes. And the third part will be a reception. So at approximately 7 o'clock, you're all invited also to join us for an informal reception here in this room. So, having said that, now, please the next slide. I like to jump directly into the sharing our conference findings, and I like to invite our 3 ambassadors, Bleeker, Maria, Abdeh, and Jorge, Alberto, Parra, Norato, to me on this stage. Please come join me. I'm also sitting down. And yes, welcome, applause, thank you. So you're probably already a little bit exhausted or maybe energized after these very intense discussions that we had the last days. So we will have probably 2 rounds, and in the first one you have already coordinated who will take which perspective when reporting back. And I will approach first Bleeker. She will probably a little bit give an overview where the discussion of the conference was moving, and then hand over to Maria and then to Jorge. Wo, are you ready? The mics are on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. Thank you, and please control my time.
Yes.
Well, this conference has been a real vibrant testimony of 40 years, around 40 years of learning processes in the field of dealing with the legacy of past atrocities or transitional justice. Many lessons learned, success, failures, and dilemmas have been identified, and that has been very important and very enriching. The good news is that the Jouannet principles against impunity, as we all know them, which form the normative corpus and the reference of this human rights-based approach, is now fully part of any transition in contexts where atrocities have been committed. And this is really a good news. Now we are facing a lot of challenges and dilemma. Maybe dilemma is a constructive word to talk about these issues. Violence and authoritarian regime have indeed not only destroyed lives cultures, nature. It has also destroyed a sense of belonging, civic trust, sense of safety, inter-individual relations. So there is no more a sense of a common shared good or a common shared public good. The transitional aspect of transitional justice, because precisely it's a human rights-based approach, is uniquely placed, we found, to facilitate the emergence of a new possible, potential common shared good or an emerging new social contract that could be a result of these processes, or should be, according to us. So the transitional dimension of TJ, so we put an emphasis on the T in these discussions, becomes as crucial as all the efforts deployed all these years with important impact in the justice side, which still continue to learn, etc., but we put an emphasis on the transitional aspect. So during these 2 years, we have identified key elements to, I would say, add quality to the transitional aspect of TJ. If the transition is meant to go towards sustainable peace, it becomes by essence mutually complementary with SDG goals, peace-building policies, and strategies with a unique added value. It is, as I said several times already, a human rights-based approach. And it can find a new good dialogue with all these other endeavors, getting out of the silo dimensions. If the transition means eliciting a new societal contract or a new common shared good, it means from the onset that constructive management of diversity is a key value, but also a key endeavor when any process of transitional justice begins. It means that diversity is at the table in practice. In other words, it's the beginning of a new emerging political dialogue with actors having different needs, different ideologies, different beliefs, and they work together to define what could be this incremental common good to be shared today, in the process, after tomorrow, and after tomorrow. So practically, youth, marginalized groups, women, of course, shall sit at the table when defining at the onset the process and expected results. If the long-term perspective is equally crucial from the onset, meaning the transitional agenda would be to support the emergence of this new societal contract, then it needs also from the onset that the time dimension be really taken into account. And we're not only here to talk about urgent needs, which are there in the short time, but short, mid, and long-term aspects, goal and expected results have to be taken into account when we begin. Still have 1 minute? Okay. It's also then from the onset the importance of strengthening cooperative dialogue between civil society and state, and capacity of state to fulfill their needs. And this is also in practice, as we go along, a political dialogue that begins to exist and to be practiced. The prevention dimension, and that's my last point, has been part of all the working groups and came out as a kind of emerging need, but also as an emerging, I would say, positive narrative in contrapoint to the guarantee of non-recurrence, who are geared toward the past. The preventive aspect needs to be consistently developed. So if transition is about a new relation between state and society, between diverse groups in society, then the identification of what unites people in the nation, of what this common good shall be all about, then can become the workshop and the pilot work that can be done around prevention. What do we share in common, and how are we going to protect it? And this is also the place where civil society and state can mutually cooperate, in particular also to make sure that the state becomes capable to act as the state fulfilling its obligation.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for this big picture. So where also our discussion in the conference was touching. Now, Maria, you I think zoom a little bit more to different examples also of recommendations, maybe about examples and findings from the workshops.
Definitely. Some of the, I think, common finding were what the importance of space. I think the word space is what the word that was the most used is establishing safe space, trust-based space. I think our colleague from the Young workshop were talking about creative, digital. So I think there is a lot of space that we can explore, but the most important thing is really to establish safe and trust-based safe. Also the word resources, access to resources to all victims. So, and the resources are not only financial, they could be access, they could be psychosocial support. There's a lot of resources that we can provide, and by providing space and resources is how we can support the leadership of the victims, and then we can listen to their priority that they define by themselves. And here our intervention could be contextualized, and I think contextualized was also a very important word during the whole 2 days. It will be trauma-informed and victim-centered. I think it is how we agree, I believe, all of us, on how we can build really a victim-centered approach. We also spoke a lot about diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality, and I was very happy that feminist terminology were used. And we all agree that I think it's not an easy task to have everybody around the table, to think about who is absent, but I think our colleague told us something very important about that. If you want to prevent, if you want to guarantee no recurrent, you should think about the inclusion of so-called unpopular victims, because otherwise they will continue to live in fear, they will continue to live the injustice and all the memories, and then these fears could be transformed onto violence or could be instrumentalized, and then we are just repeating the cycle of violence. And something important has been said also, that this trauma or violence could be also transmitted intergenerationally. So we really need to keep attention to be inclusive and to include really as much as we can victims, popular and unpopular victims. And the question, I think, is how we can do this, because or even our intervention, sometimes what we want to be inclusive could be instrumentalized, or we could instrumentalize the suffer of the people when we want people doesn't want to be together. But so how we can do it, I think. And here I will repeat, by establishing safe space, trusted base, access to resources, to document, because sometimes we know that giving access to justice is not immediate, but we need to document now so they can have access later. And I think as policymaker, we need also to review our process, because sometimes some of our administrative requirement could exclude some part of the population. And also we need to analyze the barrier to access. So sometimes we have the truth committee, but women cannot went because of social norms or anything. So we need to analyze, understand the barrier. Also by feeling empathy and solidarity, those two words were very much used, by ourselves, but also to support it within victims group. And something that really struck with me was support building alliance based on the commonality of experience across identity divide. That was a very, very important, I think, conclusions. And I want to add here, women are very good at this. And there is a lot of tasks to do, and I think we don't have to start from zero. when we enter a new context, we need to analyze what already exists, because local organization, local group have already done a lot. So analyze what exists, support existing ecosystem that work with various disciplines, especially when we want to enter and document. We will find ourselves facing a lot of requests from the population about access to food, access to health. So we can do analyze the ecosystem and do what we call the case management, transfer the people to other group that can help them with their need, and then we can and that will help us really build a trust with the community. Finally, I think I will say we are facilitator of the process. We are not the leaders. The process will be co-designed with the victims, with the actor on the ground, and this process is long-term process, and it includes also discussion about social, economic rights, access to education and health, and it is how we can help maybe shape a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for doing this great job. I can just, as a comment in between, it's really hard, tough task that all these rapporteurs and ambassadors have been doing, trying really to put together this diverse knowledge from the local perspective, from the local community. So this is really, really highly appreciated. So having said this, I hand over to Jorge, and I think you are having the task a little bit, some of the recommendations, so which means trying to find kind of common ground together. So let's see what you're bringing to the table.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a difficult task to think about the specific recommendations for policymakers because, as you said, we talk about different issues, and the information was a lot, and I'm still trying to process it. But I will say that a main recommendation will be for policymakers to have a change on the way we approach transitional justice, in order to make it a more people-centered kind of mechanism. The way to do that is try not to think about the actors and the political actors only through the lens of a rigid institutional mechanism that is what transitional justice has been doing for a long time around this toolkit, the 5 pillars, and all the stuff that we all know, but instead try to approach to people as political and responsible actors that have different demands, different opinions that need to be taken into account. So we have to achieve a transitional justice through the lens of youth, intersectionality, diversity, as Maria was also stating. And the way to do that is to promote horizontal alliances firstly between the civil society by itself, different victims groups, but also alliance with NGOs, civil society, and the institutions. What I mean by creating these alliances, and what we've been discussing these 2 days, for example, is the creation of safe spaces for victims to share their experience. The process of learning between groups of victims, groups of practitioners is very, very important for the mechanisms of transitional justice to actually work and to actually be people-centered. So the creation of these safe spaces to include youth from the very beginning of the design of the transitional justice mechanisms is another way to do it. Have a transgenerational approach is very important because, as Mo was also saying, we need to change the form we address, for example, guarantees of non-recurrence in order to understand it more as the prevention of new types of violence instead of trying not to recur in the violence of the past. And the way to do this is to bring into the table the perspectives of the young people, of the new generations, and this could be done also in order to do this. education and learning spaces must be addressed in transitional justice. So, and this is a little bit broader than the traditional transitional justice institutions that we all know. But also it's important as a recommendation to acknowledge that to secure transformation, we need a long-term process. And this is a little bit difficult because transitional justice institutions usually are very limited in the time. We create TJ institutions that only last for a few years, maybe 10 years, 3 years. But in order to secure this transformation, we need to think into a longer term. And how to do so is, the way to do it is to include these actors in the middle of the process, so even after the existence or the operation of these transitional justice institutions, people by themselves, the victims groups, women, the youth, the unpopular victims, will be demanding and monitoring the implementations of the transitional justice recommendations. For example, when talking about, I don't know, recommendations of a truth commission, the best way to achieve their implementation is to secure that people was part of the process, so people by themselves will demand the political action to implement it, even if the government changes and everything. The best way to secure this long-term process of implementation is by securing people to demand it. And how we do so is to include them in the middle of the process from the very beginning, the design, and obviously, well, during the whole operation of the transitional justice institutions. So at the end of the day, what makes the difference will be if we can achieve a local ownership of the transitional justice process. And by local, I mean local communities, but also different types of identity groups, and especially the groups that we discussed here during the 2 days, unpopular victims, women, the youth. So yeah, I think that will be all for now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jorge, also for sharing this. And I can say it was a fascinating process watching all these different workshop groups dealing with very different groups like youth with women coming together and also finding some similarities and coming up with some joint observations. So this was really a fascinating process we could observe. Now, just one quick last question. Taking all these insights, you're still digesting, of course. What would be maybe the one for you, personal, for your work and the context in which you work, the one thing you might put into practice or that you find very helpful or that might change the perspective you're doing the next steps in work? You're nodding, Jorge, so I ask you directly. You're working as a lawyer, so.
Thank you, yes. Well, I work in a tribunal that was created in Colombia for transitional justice purposes. So I think the insight that I take the most from this conference is to understand that I have to work every day with victims, but usually we do it from a very institutional, rigid perspective. We only ask victims their opinion through the lens of a specific mechanism, institutional mechanism. And this is too narrow for all they have to say, for all their positions. So I think the most important thing that I've learned is that we need to address victims, and well, not only victims, I say victims because of the Colombian context, but all these groups, not as passive recipients of the transitional justice, but instead as political agents that have their own demands, and all those demands are important for transitional justice. It's not another issue to be addressed by other people. No, it is transitional justice too, so that will be my main insight. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I hand over to Mo. So what would be in your field the next step or the key insight that you feel?
I was very impressed by the fact that hearing everyone talking, there is a very, very strong claim for a new language. It's not only the words to say transitional justice. A new language is a new vision, a new values, a new representation of political or social subjects in their journey to change their society. And this touches all the world of transitional justice. And it goes against this toolbox mechanics that, in spite of us, we have created because we needed to implant this field. And now it's a moment of the great revision, I would say, keeping what we have built and which is good, and working with these new visions from these different societies where women, men, youth are using different words to tell us their imaginary and their narratives of how societies can be transformed. And this is a big present that I take away with me from this meeting.
Thank you very much, Ro. Yeah, Maria, for your work.
Yeah. A lot that I have. I think as Syrian, it gives me some hope that we will. There is an understanding more and more that we cannot tolerate dictatorship for peace, and that to really have a sustainable peace, we really need to work toward justice. So it's given me a lot of hope. I also was very impressed and happy that in 2 days I have met in my group of women or feminists from Gambia, Georgia, and so many countries, and we feel connected in so many ways, and I think that is amazing for me, that how our experience could really connect us and how we share the same challenges and sometimes the same solutions. So I'm very happy also about the discussion about role of man and toxic masculinity and positive masculinity. I think that is part of the future, that we can be having really an inclusive discussion about violence. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, the three of you, so for sharing. For bringing voices from the conference to our stage. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope you got those who haven't participated, and maybe also those who have participated in this practitioner conference, got a kind of flavor what we have discussed and what was the journey we went. Now with our second part of this evening, we like to focus on the potential of people-centered transitional justice that has been referred to already to contribute to sustainable peace. Just to put it in a context, we're having on the one hand the UN calling for a new peace agenda, and at the same time also we are having the SDG summit, so the summit on the Sustainable Development Goals this September 2023, and also with this rather global process, there will be a revision of the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which is about peace and justice and also strong institutions. So, and we like also to feed in our findings and perspectives from the practitioners conference, and also we like to get into a dialogue between practitioners and the political and the institutional level to see how we can, bridge these perspectives and learn from each other. So for this discussion, I like to invite my panelists, and I'm not in the correct order, but just in the order I like to invite them to my table. So first, I welcome Niels Annen, the Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. A warm welcome, Mr. Annen. You're definitely one of the new faces in this evening. Then, secondly, I like to invite Fatou Baldeh. On his side, she is the Executive Director of Women in Liberation and Leadership in Gambia. Welcome, and has already contributed strongly also to this conference. Great that you're also here on stage. Then in the middle, I like to invite Markus Lenzen, the Deputy Chief of the UN Peacebuilding Fund in New York. You also were here with us. Welcome. Now you're here with the UN hat. And last but not least, on my right side, I like to invite Jehan Usop. She is from the Moro Women Development Center in Mindanao in the Philippines, and representing also a civil society organization. So welcome. What we are liking to try to explore here now in the next 45 minutes together, and after this we will also invite you to share your observations and insights, is what way so localized, people-centered approaches can contribute also to peaceful, just and inclusive societies is one question. We like to explore also what lessons we have learned from our different perspectives we are having here, and what are the challenges ahead. And of course also the question, which role the different actors, so the local communities, the national institutions, the global institutions can play and promoting peace and justice through dealing with the past. And of course what needs to be done and changed in policy and in practice also to meet the transformative potential maybe also of transitional justice. Before I invite now for the first round, just one practical information so that you're all oriented. Mr. Niels has another appointment at the Parliament, I think, at 7 o'clock. So due to some traffic issues also in our main capital city, he will leave 20 to 7, but he keeps an ear here. I think some colleagues will also be here. So you're unfortunately not here for joining also the plenary discussion, but you're represented here, and we are very glad to have you here for the time you could allow to do so. Okay, so in the first round, we like to focus a little bit more on policy agendas and processes, and also link these insights to the conference. And I will start with Markus Lenzen from the global perspective from the UN. And I like to ask first, as I've already mentioned, that the UN is already working on a new agenda for peace, but there's also preparing this SDG summit in September to review the process. Can you sketch out some of the key features the UN policy process right now, and to what extent do they address questions of justice, and particularly in crisis and conflict contents?
Sure, thank you. Since you have to leave in an hour, I can't explain them all because it would take me hours, but I will try to do it in a very short way. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and the UN Peacebuilding architecture and the fund that I represent to the conference. We support transitional justice very regularly. I personally have followed the field and played my part in it for a long time, so it's great to connect. As a preamble, something I said to participants earlier, there was some discussions about whether the field had lost its way in the last decade. And one thing I said already earlier, just spending the time with practitioners from all around the globe the last 2 days, including the two that are sitting next to me, was for me a sign that it is very much alive, but going into new directions, as we just heard. So I think that was really inspiring, in spite of all the challenges. So what's going on at the UN in terms of the big policy pictures, and how are they mutually reinforcing, and justice and human rights, how do they feature? So very important, as many of you know, the Secretary General set out a report, Our Common Agenda, in 2021. It was his big vision for the future of global cooperation in the next 25 years. I'm going to say this now, it featured very strongly here, and a lot of what I'll sketch briefly. He puts a strong emphasis on youth engagement in peace and security, and on women engagement in peace and security. It's in the Common Agenda, it's in the things I'll mention next, so I'll try to come back to it, but it's really very prominent, and he places a strong emphasis on it. Key in Our Common Agenda were his call to write a new vision for the rule of law, support of the UN, and the new agenda for peace. This is very much in view of bolstering SDG 16 for peaceful, just, secure societies. So the new vision for the rule of law of the Secretary General is almost finished, so that's coming out soon. It has very much, again, people-centered approach to justice at the forefront of its vision. It's very gender responsive and recognizes a lot that rule of law is very closely and inherently integrated with human rights. It's not something that's somehow separate, that you can do this, and calls on UN support to help member states achieve SDGs to enable development of peaceful, just and equitable societies in a way that really protects people, right? So that's coming out soon. The new agenda for peace. We heard Andrew say in the beginning, I think was it Andrew or Mo? Somebody was saying earlier, a lot about the shared common good, that in a sense peace is in the new agenda for peace. I think it was Mo, is very much a vision and an effort of the Secretary General to set out that peace and prevention is a shared global common good, and it wants to set a very much a marker for recalling the universality of peace for the globe. So that's also in its final stages. We think that it's going to be ready by the end of June, the paper that the UN will be writing, so it's coming soon. There have been extensive consultations in the past months with member states from all regions, with civil society organizations. Hope some of you have contributed to it. There were open calls to do so. I'm happy to take messages from here back as well. A lot of what colleagues were saying that's coming out of the consultation is, on the positive side, almost all member states agree on the magnitude of the challenges that the globe faces in this regard. Harder to find agreement on what the right solutions are. So the Secretary General wants this really to be a call to action for member states. It will try to be very comprehensive on the peace and security mechanisms that we need in the future, but very much prioritize prevention and peace-building action. So, yeah, to be short, and a lot of that will be also in terms of what that means about how to better invest in national peace-building infrastructures and capacities, right? That's really key for it. Address regional dimensions, very much funding for all of this. We've heard already a bit about, from Andrew, in this case it was Andrew, about how the trends go in this regard. We had a very important General Assembly resolution last September. It was remarkably universally adopted on financing for peace building, so not a single member state objected. Everybody recognized this is important and what needs to happen, but it still needs to put into action, right? So in addition, there's one more thing that is almost ready to come out, and that is a new guidance note of the Secretary General on transitional justice that will have a close link to the new agenda for peace. The last and first one was written in 2010. A lot of what we've been hearing here is the field has evolved a lot, and this guidance note wants to recognize that. So it'll be a thorough revision of the guidance note of 2010. It's still not quite done, so again, I'm happy to take messages back on that. But it's very much about recognizing transitional justice much more as a strategic instrument and approach for longer-term goals. And a lot of the issues we've been discussing here on people-centered approaches, how to be more inclusive in these approaches, etc., will be reflected therein. So I'll close with just saying all of this is happening. All of them will be coming out soon. They will be, I think, important guidance for the UN, but they're also a call for action for member states. And the SDG Summit in September, the Preparatory Summit for ministers in September, for the Future Summit, that's at the end of 2024. All of these will be key political moments to see how member states are recommitting to core values of the UN that are so much about global peace, given the state of conflict that we have in the world. So a lot of smaller and bigger opportunities. Incidentally, or even next Friday, the Peacebuilding Commission is having a special session on transitional justice. It will feature member states from Colombia and the Gambia and Timor-Leste talking and sharing with member states their experiences with transitional justice mechanisms. So again, just to say, it's very much present at the UN, and there's a lot going on.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, if I listen to you, I already get some ideas for the answer for my next question, which is, now you also have listened, and you were also present now in the practitioners' conference the last 2 days. Having been participating here and listening also to the insights, do some of them or do they resonate with aspects that are currently discussed at the UN level? I mean, you have already mentioned youth and some of them have mentioned when it comes to peace building and implementing SDG 16, but maybe you like also to mention other aspects that haven't been mentioned yet. And
yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one thing in the bigger picture, you know, in terms of the role of you know, let me put it this way. So when we're thinking about peace building, sustaining peace, and what the new agenda for peace will about, including security dimension, but if we think about how to realize positive peace, so not just the absence of violence, but a much wider understanding of peace, then I think it's important that it really requires an examination of the role of justice in it. Yeah? That there needs to be greater emphasis on realizing how the people themselves, we again heard about this earlier, to ask them what their aspiration of justice is and their concept of justice. And a lot of the discussions we had here in the conference were also about this, the path from transitional justice, which started, as Mo called it at some point, you know, from very much a concept of criminal justice plus, to say that the plus is actually even more important, perhaps, than in the sum total, than a focus that's just on punishment of perpetrators, and that it needs to be much more about satisfying victims' needs, the right to information, to remedy, to reparation, etc., and move away from a focus that's just on redress. So I think that is a lot in tune with what we were discussing here, and I think will be featured there. And I think the new guidance note of the Secretary General on Transitional Justice will also, it seeks a lot to think about the transformative potential of transitional justice, which incidentally is the title of our conference here, and looking at the challenges, but also the potential here, how to be more strategic and pragmatic and not just principled and technical in their approach, but still very much human rights based, right? That I think the human rights foundation of this is what really is the added value, and has a strong preventive dimension in it, right? So, yeah, maybe just to say that in all of this, the call and how transitional justice matters in all of these other processes, that there's a really strong case to say that the recognition, and you know, we talked a lot here about the acknowledgement of wrongs that were done in the past, especially with mass human rights violation, how they are remembered, how they are acknowledged in societies is really key for, you know, rebuilding social contracts, for preventive approaches. So I think that's, you know, a number of things that really matter. And the cross-pillar nature of this, that this is not a technical issue that one actor in their corner alone does, right? It's not just about some human rights NGO here or OHCHR in the UN case. It really matters for a broad range of organizations, for the development actors, alike. It's a member state responsibility. Civil society plays a big role. We see this a lot here in maintaining the momentum, making people's voices heard. So that's really important to move out of a perception that transitional justice is some technical fix where you tick a few boxes in its pillars.
Thank you very much for sharing these insights. Now I like to move to the national perspective, and I hand over to Niels Annen. And I like to ask you now, again, referring to the SDG midterm review, being a special moment to shape also, again, the implementation of the Agenda 2030 in the next decade. I see in your face, it seems to be a big task. How does the ministry support now, especially also here, the implementation of the SDG 16 to promote peaceful, just and inclusive societies?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, for having me, and I was happy that I get at least, you know, a glimpse of what you have been doing here, and the discussions, which is fascinating and very, also personally, on a personal note, very interesting to see, as I have been dedicating some time on some of the countries that have been discussed. A colleague from Colombia here, for example, which has always been very high on the agenda for the German government, and where we are following and hoping that some new political realities will give that development another push. But I don't want to be distracted. If we look at that midterm review, we are, I mean, skeptical, even frightened to see, you know, what the results will will be. And that's not only because of our SDG 16 that we are discussing here today. The SDG agenda was never perfect, but it is the only reference to the whole, spectrum of development-related issues. It is today's common agenda, if you will. And in development cooperation, we are often faced with a dilemma in a way, or with the expectation that is not always realistic. And it goes in both ways. Some of our critics believe that, we are wasting government's money to corrupt regimes, or our projects are not efficient and we are not achieving enough. And then there are those who believe that you have so much money at your hand, and you need to be able, to solve all the problems, including core political, conflicts that we are faced with. Both is not true, but what is true is that if the world comes together, as we did with the SDG agenda, with the 2030 agenda, we proved that it was possible to make progress in key questions like fighting poverty. And if you look at today's numbers, it's devastating what the last 2-3 years had brought to the SDG agenda. And we all know some of the reasons. Of course, the economic consequences of COVID are still being underestimated here in the rich countries. In Germany, we had been able, to support our population with big support packages. And our economy, in spite of everything, remains very robust. If you talk to businessmen in Germany, their most concerning question today is how to get skilled labor. If I talk to many of our partner countries all over the world, there's a very different picture. So we lost a lot, significant progress in many of the SDGs. But coming back to number 16, I think just the recent developments over the last days and hours showed us with Sudan, for example, where German cooperation is very present and remained present even, after the transition or the democratic process was unfortunately interrupted. That shows us how important that issue is, because you cannot achieve your development goals, the international or the national set goals, if you are not able to contribute to a peaceful settlement of conflicts. And even if you settle, the violent conflict itself, it will still be a huge challenge to achieve sustainable development without reconciliation. And that's why we are investing in that very much. And that's why I'm very happy to share the stage here with practitioners and listening also to the examples that are being putting forward. It is about resources, it's about money, but especially when it comes to the issue that we are dealing with, in comparison to just the packages of support that I mentioned to the German economy, we're talking about relatively little money with a huge impact. And that's what we are trying to, promote. That's why I think such a conference is very helpful also for the discussions that we are having. We also need to convince our parliament to appropriate the necessary funds, but we are also proud about what we could achieve together over the last years. And we've tried to bring that to the UN conference, but also to the process that then leads to the next steps.
Thank you very much, Mr. Annen, for putting this also in the perspective and also sharing also what different expectations are there. And again, new perspectives. I also like to ask to you the question, which might be a little bit challenging now because it was a speed report, but having listened to some of the insights of the conference, do they resonate somewhere also with the priorities or approaches currently you're discussing in the ministry when it comes to peace building and SDG 16?
Yeah, well, I mean, the German government has a framework to deal with those questions. That's an important reference for us. And I mean, if you look here at that nice stage, you see the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice, which we put a lot of emphasis in. And I think both the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, but also the Foreign Office, where I have been working in the last government, are trying to coordinate as best as possible our efforts, because I mean, sometimes we overlap a little bit between development cooperation and humanitarian aid, and that's more of a German decision to divide the two, and we try to make it as easy as possible for our partners. And I believe the building of networks and sustaining a network, it's very important, it's very crucial. Government can fund, can sometimes highlight an issue, and as I mentioned the example of Colombia, there are others. There are examples where we are proud to talk about, but there are also examples where it's better not to talk in a certain stage, you know, of a political process. And then I believe, although it's always difficult to compare, but this country here had its own experience in history in dealing with the past, you know, with our terrible Nazi past, which as a German politician, even of my age, you're well advised not to ignore. And I would even say, if you're in development cooperation and foreign policy, you cannot ignore it. And the more recent past, bringing together basically a divided nation, you know, with the atrocities that we saw being committed during the communist dictatorship in East Berlin, so in East Germany. So that is something where, you know, we sometimes can bring actors and personalities from our own country to share experience, if that is requested. You know, we don't, you know, this is not a promotion, but it is something where we can refer to and to try to connect what we are looking at.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I just like Miro because this aspect of mutual learning and exchanging perspectives is something that resonated very much also here in this room the last 2 days, which was found very valuable to learn from each other and to hear these different perspectives. So I think this will be highly appreciated. Yeah, now it's time to turn to Fatou from Gambia, Executive Director, Women Liberation Leadership. And now we a little bit focus also to a practical experience. As has been mentioned, so the people-centered justice approach is a notion that takes people's diverse needs as a starting point and broadens then the justice agenda also to overcome these deep-rooted historical and structural inequalities. And now in your country, after 20 years of dictatorship, Gambia initiated a transitional justice process and also published just recently also a report of a Truth Commission. You've been involved personally also in this process right from the start. So can you tell us, we're curious to learn from you, so how people-centered the process was until now?
Much, and I am really pleased to be here. So yes, when we started the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, firstly, the Gambia has a very high illiteracy rate. Poverty levels are high. After 22 years of dictatorship, we had a lot of issues to deal with. So when the TRRC came out, again, we had an act. It was in English. It was sitting at, you know, very high level. But immediately, civil society, particularly women-led organizations and the National Youth Council took over. And firstly, we wanted to make sure that the citizens, victims and victim communities really understood what the TRRC Act was. But we also wanted to consult citizens, again, the same groups, to understand what their expectations of the TRRC was. How did they envisage the TRRC? What did they want to see? What did participation means to them? What does justice means to them? What does reparations means to them? And but also, how do we reconcile as a country? So through this, we embarked on like a nationwide tour where we went into communities in the deepest of rural communities. And most of this was led by civil society organizations with support from the Ministry of Justice. So I do have to say the political will is quite important, which luckily we do have until now. So we went into communities, we held community dialogues just to try to understand. But when we did this as well, we followed it with position papers. How do we want to see the composition of the commission? Like, we proposed that we wanted women as part of the commissioners because we knew that if it was just left to the selecting committee or to appoint, due to discriminations that existed, women wouldn't be there. So we proposed that at least 4 members of the commissioners have to be women. We propose also that youth have to be involved we have to have youths. We also propose that part of the commissioners, rural communities, have to be involved as well, because we wanted the perspective of everybody, that it was inclusive. And also when we went into communities to conduct our dialogue and exchange ideas, we realized that in most contexts, when we brought communities together to talk, because of the way that our culture and beliefs and norms dictate, the men usually spoke and the women didn't speak. So we realized that, actually, unconsciously, we realized that our society dictates that men speak on behalf of women, and when a man speaks, a woman does not follow. So we realized that in these dialogues, although we were taking these concepts to the communities, existing structures were still preventing people. So through that also, we initiated safe spaces for women. We initiated women-only listening circles. We created safe spaces for marginalized and vulnerable groups to make sure that we were intentionally being inclusive in the process. But we also followed up with position papers to the Ministry of Justice requesting that psychosocial support must be inclusive throughout the process. We also asked for a gender unit to be developed within the secretariat. And in addition to that, we also trained the commissioners to be gender sensitive. The statement takers, when you're taking a statement with a victim, be gender sensitive, be victim-centered and person-centered. So from the beginning of our TRRC, we were very much inclusive, and we drove the process, which actually led to like national acceptance and national ownership of the TRRC process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a quite impressive example also on how transformative such a process can be. Because we were discussing a lot about restoration, which has this looking back, but here it's really about the future and really changing also the root causes which have. So this is very nice from my perspective, very nice example. Jehan, I saw you nodding. Now you're from the Moro Women Development and Cultural Center, and we heard also already, so there are a lot of commonalities probably the women experience. Now, I like to ask you, especially now also with the link between local peace building and addressing also violent past. So you're engaged since many years also in peace building and reconciliation in Mindanao, where the violence is still present. And so how does this influence your peace-building efforts, and how do you address to deal with it in your work?
Thank you so much.
It's on. He will turn it louder. Yeah.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the privilege and opportunity to share our experience and narratives. It's really far away to bring our story here or narratives here. Just a few background of our context. We've been I don't want to take you to our historical background way back 300 years ago after the Spaniard colonization. But we've been experiencing conflict for 4 decades before we had our agreement. And in that 4 decades, that leads us to marginalization, oppression, and being pushed away from our land. Almost, it's it's really the marginalization, and this also give us the opportunity, or it's kind of eye-opening to be engaged in the peace building. And in that experience, I have the different stages of peace building experience. First, before we had our agreement, during the conflict, we are engaged in human rights advocacy and human rights promotion, and we did a lot of advocacy in our grassroots level. Sorry. Yeah. And the next part is when we had our peace negotiation. And peace negotiation is really need to be pushed, and the engagement of the civil society really give influence or force to pursue the negotiation. And then when we had our agreement, it has to be in place the organic law. We need to have our we need to ratify our Bangsamoro organic law, and there is a need of civil society participation in influencing the policymaker to really to ratify the law, because along the way there were lots of challenges, not only from the government as whom deprived us, but also from the the horizontal people, the horizontal stakeholders. So then that in that stage, we really need to advocate our right to self-determination until the Bangsamoro organic law has been passed. And now we have this Bangsamoro organic law paved the way to establish the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, which is the new government entity we are having right now in the Bangsamoro. And along the way, there are lots of challenges as well. Although the Bangsamoro organic law is there, but there were lots of agreed in the peace process that never been implemented. And one of these is the transition, the component in normalization, or the normalization annex. And part of this normalization annex is the TJRC, or transitional justice and reconciliation. So right now we are still advocating. At the moment, what we are doing is really it's really a people-centered kind of thing in terms of peace building. Like we are advocating through radio program, and one of this is and the other thing is the capacitation of women, to really engage them, advancing the participation of women in the political process and decision making. And not only for that, we are also doing the participation or the advancing of the role of women in conflict or in the peace process or the peace mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So what I learn now from listening to you is really the many fields you're working in just to make things happen, and so that you're getting the law, that you're getting it implemented, that the relevant actors are also involved and the different perspectives. You're really engaged in many different frontiers, so to say, in the whole process. Thank you very much. Now with the second round of questions, and my aim is that at the last round of this I can also head towards Mr. Annen before he has to leave, so I will keep this in mind. Because now we like a little bit also to, of course, to look at opportunities, challenges of people-centered approaches, and also draw some conclusions and recommendations. So a little bit try kind of harvesting here. And I will start also now with you, Fatou, first. And I will throw 3 questions to you. So first is now, if you're looking at the experience in Gambia, so from this experience, what are the opportunities and challenges for people-centered transitional justice? That's the first question. And the second question will be revisiting now also the insights from the conference. Is there something that could inform also the practice around people-centered transitional justice, maybe also to link this to the challenges? And the third question I throw to you is what would you recommend then also to policymakers and practitioners to promote people-centered transitional justice? And you can pick which one you like to elaborate the most.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think I will start with the challenges and opportunities. So again, because the work I did mostly was around gender justice, so I would speak on that. So one of the things, the opportunities that the TRRC especially provided for Gambia is that there was a big culture of silence around sexual violence. And I was, during the conference here, I was saying to some people that in our local languages, we don't even have a name for rape. So when the Truth Commission started, it was difficult, even when women wanted to come willingly, how do you describe being sexually violated? First of all, we don't learn about sexual health education, healthy education, in depending what context they use it. So a lot of women didn't know what SGBV meant. So women would come and report other violations and not talk about SGBV. So one of the things that the Truth Commission really did for us was to bring out the prevalence of SGBV. And I think civil society, very much women-led organizations, we used the vehicle of transitional justice to really amplify the voices of women, but also bring out other structural existing issues that affect women. For instance, low participation of women in politics. We also use the same vehicle of transitional justice to address issues around child marriage, issues around female genital mutilation, issues around girls' education. We may think that in the formal transitional justice, that's something different. But we wanted to prove that Gambian women, for a very long time, have been victims of gender-based violence. And we use the vehicle of transitional justice to really amplify this. We also, because we were going through the TJ process still, we have the opportunity of international organizations coming to train us. So we really took advantage of this and to advocate. We also used international mechanisms like the UPR and the CEDAW to report on what Gambia is lacking behind when it comes to women's rights. We also use the existing African charters like the Mobutu Protocol. So for us, we really use the TJ vehicle to our advantage on that. With regards to challenges, even though the transitional justice, the Truth Commission really made it as much as possible for women to take part and to some extent marginalized communities, existing inequalities and structural violence prevented women from taking part. So the fear of stigma, for instance, stopped a lot of women from coming to share their stories. And so that was a big challenge. Or the fact that marginalized communities like LGBT communities, even though their rights were violated and this was documented, they couldn't come because we have a law that criminalizes homosexuality. So that became a problem. The second question.
Or maybe we jump to the third one.
Yes,
I mean, the
okay.
second would, because just to make it more...
That's fine.
Yeah.
Basically, the second one for me from this conference is that I saw that being a woman, it didn't matter where you come from in the world, most of our experiences are similar when it comes to violence, when it comes to intersectionalities. I saw the women from Syria, from Gambia, from everywhere. We all had similar experiences. Now, for recommendations, I think it is very important that when we're looking at transitional justice and initiatives, we really take it back to the communities. It needs to be national and locally driven, because that means the focus will always remain. But also we need to move away from, like policymakers and funders, we need to move away from ticking boxes, asking for numbers, and concentrate on transformative approaches, like addressing those root causes of violence. Because if we're really talking about non-reoccurrence, we must go back and address those structural inequalities, the root causes and consequences of violence.
Thank you very much, Fatou. Yeah. I will now throw the ball to Markus Lenzen to the UN level, and because the Peacebuilding Fund is also supports transitional justice and peacebuilding processes since many years. So I also throw 3 questions to you, and I will help you to go through it. So first, I want to know, what are your lessons learned with regard to the contribution of transitional justice to promote peaceful, just, and inclusive societies? So really this lessons learned with respect to the transformative potential, let's say. Then also, what have been the challenges you found so far? And watching this, so what needs to be done differently within the UN family to support transitional justice process a little bit better in future?
Okay, so yes, to give you a sense just how much transitional justice features as a topic that the UN Peacebuilding Fund, which is a central multi-donor pooled fund mechanism that works mostly through a whole range of UN agencies, but we can respond very quickly and flexibly to peacebuilding needs as long as member states request it, so national ownership is important to us. But we work sort of with almost every UN agency, from the Development Program to the Human Rights Commission's Office to the International Organization for Migration to the World Food Program, just to show you the breadth. And a lot of them, over 10 UN agencies, are also involved in transitional justice processes. So just to again show how cross-cutting the issue is, right, that I said earlier. And also directly with civil society organizations, often through these UN organizations. And the fund exists since 2006. It was created by member states back then. And just looking at, we've been supporting transitional justice throughout. I've been looking a bit at numbers, but to give you a sense of scale, just in the last 7 years, we've been supporting transitional justice in 15 countries with over $80 million. This is about 5% of all the peacebuilding support we give. We support a lot of different things, from dialogue processes to peace processes to demobilization processes to security sector reform. So there's a lot of different things. So 5% may sound little, but it's consistent. So it's there. It's a regularly occurring demand. What can we learn about the transformative potential? I think the best thing is to ask the people from the countries themselves. I think the main thing I will say is that it's just the time factor, right? The real transformation, because we've been talking about structural changes in society, rarely happen during the cycle of a project that we fund, which tend to be 2 to 3 years long, right? It takes long, and often we fund initiatives in a sequence, right? And here it is important, I think it's already a key lesson sort of on the funding side, that, we're, in some countries, we're quite an important funder. We've been very proportionally big funder of the Colombian Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, very big in the Gambia. In some other countries, there are other donors that are much bigger, but the challenge is really still how to sequence and maintain the accompaniment in a way that both the quantity and the quality of the funding over time, right? I'll try to come back to that a little bit. because the transformation aspiration will take time, right, and to sustain it. The kind of things that we funded is really across the range of all the different aspects of transitional justice that we've been talking about. And I think something that we've been trying to do more of is really, because it's the UN, you know, and we are trying to hold up very much that it's sort of equal rights for everyone, is to be as inclusive as possible, right? Now, on one hand, to say something that still really needs to improve is, I think over the time since transitional justice has become codified as a field, so the last 20 years, the UN really hasn't played an important role in developing the field through the norm setting that the United Nations can and must do, right? And in the way that it supports member states who are going through these processes. But arguably, and I alluded to this earlier, the potential of transitional justice still hasn't been fully utilized, because it has so often been this technical approach. Well, we support a particular mechanism and don't think enough about how to be more strategic and transformative and how to integrate it more into longer-term peacebuilding strategy. So, as I said earlier, the new guidance note of the Secretary General will try to redress that and recognize and change that, right? But at the same time, I think it's important not to overpromise, because I think in a lot of cases also, when we have seen at the moment that transitional justice mechanisms get in place, they raise a lot of expectation in the sometimes the population doesn't learn enough about them. In other cases, they do more to really tell people about it. But they raise a lot of expectation in situations of a lot of need, and then it takes a long time for it to deliver, to deliver tangible changes, right? The recognition is important, but so we also need to be somewhat realistic. Now, a couple of things, you know, and again, recognize sort of the time and the commitment sort of it takes. I think coming back to the funding issue, I mean, I already said, I really think it's important that a donor community, but also, you know, the national actors, because it doesn't work if it's only funded externally, because then we have the problem that the ownership isn't there, right? And it doesn't just have to be money, right? And often it's not about lots and lots of money, but spend well in the right way, but really over time. I cannot forget, and I will do it at this point, that we can only do this and give member states the predictability that we can accompany them over time if member states fund us, because we are completely voluntarily funded through member states. And I have to recognize Germany in this regard, because Germany is our largest donor by far these days, through the Federal Foreign Office of Germany in this case. And they're a very strong promoter of this agenda. There's a number of other member states that are very important as well in this regard. But again, it's the commitment that we need for this to sustain it, right? And to continue doing so, and to continue to, but also then continue to support it at the country level. I would like to, I mean, actually, without me telling you a long list of lessons learned, I would like to do a little bit of advocacy or promotion for, we do, every year we publish 1 or 2 thematic reviews to look back at previous 5 years of things we've supported to draw out lessons. 3 years ago, we published one on our support to transitional justice processes. And, you know, I'm just looking again at sort of what some of the key recommendations were of this, right? They found a number of the initiatives we supported did good and well, and people, you know, were happy that they received the support. The issue of sustaining it was often a challenge, right? But there's a number of other things that speak already then a lot to things we've been saying here in terms of how we support, the kind of programming. Just to pick some, right? How important it is to do a thorough analysis of the actors to really identify the priority and TJ needs with a participatory approach. Don't have just some external consultant do you know, a flyover analysis, really engage people in coming up with it. Strengthen the inclusivity in how we design and implement projects throughout, including in the monitoring systems, right? You can design monitoring systems with external consultants, but you can also do it with a lot of feedback from and with the populations. Don't just extract the information from them, feed it back to them. You know, a number of different aspects that all speak to how to do programming in this regard, more people-centered way. So read it, I think it's still really relevant. And I think I'll just finish with a few things that personally, listening to the conference, but in my own views, that still need more attention in terms of lessons of what needs more attention. You've heard colleagues summarize earlier already the importance of taking a trauma a trauma-sensitive approach to transitional justice. And I think that's very important because mental health issues and how long-lasting and intergenerational they are so grievous, when you had mass human rights violations, but the capacities to address them are very rarely there, and it's, from a funding perspective, usually the last thing that anybody does, unless it sort of comes up a bit in healthcare. So how to do this in a more informed way, in a way that's appropriate for these contexts, is another thing we fund more and more, but very few donors are in that space, and I think that needs a lot more attention. Youth, we talked a lot about this already, but we saw in our review there was a lot of efforts to make youth participation a key theme, but often, and too often, it remained at, well, they got invited to something. But the challenge we heard several times at the conference is it needs to be more than that. You really need to, and we don't, without criticizing anybody's age, I'm certainly no longer a youth person, right? But, there was already calls to say, in panels like this, the conversation would change if, we did this. Those were some reflections in the conference. And then just one last thing that I think is still very much undervalued or underthought of, and it didn't really come up, I think, it wasn't in all sessions, is technology. Right, technology, I think, has a really big transformative potential for justice systems in terms of access and so forth and information, but that will only become relevant in the context that we're talking about if we bridge the digital divide. It's another big priority topic for the Secretary General, coincidentally, so my boss will be happy I mentioned it, but I really think it's something that needs a lot more attention in this space, so I'll finish there.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I having in mind that Mr. Annen has to leave within the next 10 minutes, or 9 to be precise. So I would I would now hand over to you, and after this I will hand over again to you, just for the process, so that you can also a little bit reflect. Then also I will give you the opportunity, and then also you can also come in with your observations and contributions. So please be prepared. But first of all, so what are you taking out of this discussion so far with respect to people-centered approaches?
I would say an encouragement for what we have been putting pretty much in the center of our development policy since Minister Schulze took office, which is to develop a feminist development policy. And as you mentioned, the Foreign Office, which is funding you, which is a good decision to continue that. So they have also been developing a feminist foreign policy strategy, and we're trying to coordinate that as well. And it sounds, at the first glance, abstract to some. It still sounds apparently pretty provocative to others. But I think listening to you, for example, it's really like confirmation for what we have been trying to do. Of course, not only with regards to SDG 16 and everything that is related to it, but I think it becomes more and more obvious that if we want to manage and design those processes in an effective way, it's not just a matter of equality and justice. It is also a matter of, is it going to work or not? And excluding women and girls who often are bearing most of the burden and are often heaviest hit by conflict and violence, and often, as you mentioned, also neglected the access to help, but also psychological help. That has become, in so many aspects, the biggest hurdle to our development goals, that I really believe the question of looking at a feminist development policy is becoming more and more important. And as always, in what we are trying to do, you have a political aspect, which is what we are doing today, to explain, to have a discussion, to have an exchange. But then development policy is often very concrete, because also in times of more and more scarce resources in terms of official development assistance, we have to take decisions about priorities. and then working with our partners like GIZ and others, we need to be very clear who is going to benefit from what we're doing. That means we have to get the indicators right. That's then, again, very technical and could turn into a very boring discussion. But I think it's very relevant, and it's highly relevant and political. And so we set a very ambitious goal with that regard, and I hope that at the end of our turn, we will be able to present concrete results as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Annen, for sharing this and also for being with us. I think there are still 5 minutes. I don't know if you like to jump, because we've heard there are some blockages on the road, but
maybe let me just say that we are in the German government very determined to remain a reliable partner when it comes to the different agendas and conflict theaters, but also when it comes to funding. So, I mean, everybody knows that we are who's following German politics at least, that we are in the midst of a kind of tricky budget negotiation right now, because the effects that I mentioned in the very beginning also are impacting the German economy, although not in the same, with the same magnitude. But I'm very optimistic that we will remain a reliable partner and that we will be able to maintain also the networks that we have established, working together with partners and also benefiting from the enormous expertise and also, the courage of those actors who are working in the communities. I cannot do that. I have a day job to do, but I think we can sometimes highlight also the success stories, because that's important to me as well. It takes resources, it takes courage, it takes time, but it has an effect what we're doing. And sometimes we need to remind people out there that, yes, what you see in the news is terrible, and we need to have a response, often a humanitarian response to a current crisis. But there are also ways to positively influence what is happening on this globe, and that's maybe what I just wanted to add with a note of gratitude to all of you. And sorry that I have to leave you, but I, that that sometimes schedules are a bit packed. But vielen Dank.
Thank you very much for being with us. So thank you very much, and and wish you a good way to the Parliament. Yeah, we will continue our discussion here. I will first hand over also then to Jehan, but you're invited now also, and as I said, always, and time is running out suddenly, and then you're getting the ideas you like to share. So please be prepared. There will be also microphones coming to you, so we will have probably then 2, 3 maybe contributions after this, and then to make a joint closure here in the panel. But I also like to hear from Jehan. Now we were at this point of challenges and also opportunities with dealing with the past process at grassroots level. So I also like to you, so where do you see also maybe opportunities and challenges, and what type of recommendations you might draw then also with respect to the international institutions from your perspective?
Thank you. For the opportunities, I think one big opportunity that we are having now is we already have the agreement. We are now in the transitional government, and this transition government provides us to pass laws that could govern us, and which is it's that really answer our needs, and of course the strong participation of our people, the strong engagement of all sectors, especially women. Now, women is also, we are seeing it as big potential and opportunity, you know. We are very much engaged in women. Our women really engage in many aspects, you know, advocacy, peace building work, and of course the peace mechanism, and even conflict resolution and mediation. They are now very much engaged, and of course the youth, no. So and of course the support of the government as well, in the national government is they are very much working closely with our parliament government in our region. The challenge is there were lots of unimplemented in the agreement.
Yeah.
And we are running out of time in the transition. There are other factors or factions in our local context. For example, the presence of private armed groups, the presence of terrorist-inspired group are there. The ASG or the Abu Sayyaf, those are challenging the peace process and the spoilers of peace as well. For example, the traditional politicians who doesn't want the MILF to lead, to be in the lead, no. So these are really challenging. From the community level, there are also challenges that we are seeing. For example, the perception of women participation is also there. We are still, you know, the stigmatization or stigmatism of women participation. It really like intertwining the process. So that is the challenges that we are confronting.
All right. It was, are there any recommendations
Ah,
from your perspective with
Yeah.
respect to the policy sphere or the institutions? And I still also have a look if there will be some voices.
There were mentioned some recommendation earlier, like the CSO engagement or participation. In our context, we only have to sustain it or strengthen it because we are already doing it. The participation of CSO is already there. The dialogues, you know, conducting of multi-sectoral dialogue. We already doing it, and I think we only have to increase it or strengthen it, and of course the inclusivity is also very much in our context, like which is also this is also one another challenge. Because there were lots of the diversity of people in our community. So sometimes you have to deal with that because inclusivity, the principle is there's no one should be left behind, you know. So and but on the other hand, they are demanding a lot. Now, for example, we have to deal with the indigenous people. We have to deal with the settler, meaning the non-Muslims, and we have to deal with other sectors, you know. So that is also another kind of challenge. But then this inclusivity should be in place and should be continued. So I think the recommendations here is how to sustain, how to see the sustainability of the process, especially the implementation of this transitional justice. And one more thing is the implementation of transitional justice should be religiously done, because transitional justice is not really, doesn't mean that we are taking the people to heaven, you know, but it is meant to take them away from hell. You know, that's so that's
Now I relax.
so I think implementation, because if you don't have this justice, what is the peace meant for? You know, you cannot see the meaningful peace if there is no justice. So I think we and I'm sure Mom Mo Bleeker is listening. She is the transitional TJRC chairperson. So yeah, I think it has to be religiously implemented, and there is a push should be to be done from the international communities for these things to be happened. And it's kind of a top to bottom approach, or we called it bibingka approach. You know, bibingka is a food that you have to put fire under and beneath. So the pressure should be like that. I'm sorry, but
I like to get a picture of this.
yeah. So yeah, but I think that is the recommendation that. I don't want to be very, very specific on what we have done here in terms of recommendation. But for me, implementing of what we have signed in the agreement for the Moro is well enough for us to be taken in this hell. So I think that is my my plea to really support us in terms of seeking sustainable and meaningful peace. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Jehan. Yeah, I take this picture. So now there's, I mean, let's say maybe 5 to 10 minutes we're having for your maybe contributions rather, or thoughts with respect also the potential of people-centered approaches for transforming societies and for sustainable justice and peace. So if there's any thought you like to share, there's one person I see. Any more? And the second one, very good. So yeah, and then the Herr behind, and then yes, and then wonderful. Great. Okay, so you will be the last one and the third one. Please just introduce your name, institution.
Yes, I am Eduardo González. Pretty concrete question. So, look, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Mali, Peru, there are backslidings. There are countries where you initiate transitional justice processes, and after a while you will have the extinction of political will, or cycle of violence again, or instinctive authoritarian reactions by elites. So what are we doing in terms of building resiliency for transitional justice processes? Resiliency for the victims networks that were emerging and that were active during the TJ process, resiliency for the institutions that have been created, resiliency for the processes in general, and what are the allies and the actors to do this?
Okay, thank you very much for your question and or thought which is behind it. So I will collect it, and then we make also final round here, but it's already thought you're sharing by this. Thank you very much. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Achim Johansen, working on governance issues in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. My question is mainly to Markus Lenzen, as in the UN, of course, besides the Peacebuilding Fund, there are other units working on issues somehow related. For instance, the global program on strengthening the rule of law. And I'm wondering to what extent there is cooperation between stakeholders working on transitional justice on the one hand, and those working on structural changes concerning rule of law in partner countries in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now here's a gentleman in the first row, and after this, also the lady. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hugo van der Merwe from the Global Survivors Fund. My question specifically to Fatou and also to Marcus. In terms of, I mean, I know in the Gambia there's now the reparations bill is about to be presented to Parliament, and this is usually where things fall flat in terms of so many transitional justice processes where for the survivors that this is the priority, this is the most immediate thing, and it's the most long-term challenge that they face is that reparations often get recommended, and we have fantastic recommendations from truth commissions, and they are never implemented, or they are very partially implemented, and survivors 10 years later, 20 years later, feel betrayed, feel a lot of this was a waste of their time, they were misled. What are your feelings? And often this is also where the consultation processes break down and survivors don't get consulted sufficiently in the implementation, in the running of reparations programs. So, and the other side of the question is where's the funding coming from, and where does the UN fund, where do international donors come in when it comes to funding? Because that's also where there's so much investment in justice processes and prosecutions, but when it comes to the survivors' priorities, we don't see that resources coming through.
Thank you very much also for sharing observations also, and then also raising these questions. Yes.
Good evening. It's been a great 2 days just listening, and perhaps my thoughts and comments and questions go to all the three panelists, but also just a reflection.
Would you introduce yourself also, because not everyone knows you yet?
My name is Christina Lai. I work both in Kenya and South Sudan, co-founder of Utu Wetu Trust in Kenya, and advisor to the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. And so, just as you were all speaking, I think the question that's percolating in my mind is whether we now need to be discussing post-TJ processes. And the reason I say so, I'm thinking about Gambia now and reflecting on the journey that we have traveled in Kenya for the past 12 years, maybe more than that, since 2008. It's what? It's actually 14, 15. Right?
Getting more.
It's getting more. Gambia is just beginning the process of agitating for implementation of reparations. Our TJRC completed its work and filed its report in May 2013. Not a single letter in it has been deliberately implemented. South Sudan is now just in the process of drafting its TRC bill. And it's going to be exactly what Hugo said if we're not able to bring these lessons to bear in emerging processes. And so the question for me is, how do we bring these lessons to bear in emerging processes so that they don't have to go through this same vicious cycle? How do we fine-tune our language and our framing, for instance, in the upcoming Truth Commission law, so that we're actually presenting transitional justice processes as a moment in time to begin to shift our culture and our practice, but in fact, beginning to develop policies and funding and thinking to the long term, integrating with human rights policies, integrating with peace building and development. And I think really so that we move away, when I look at TJ literature and we speak about implementation, we stop at time constraint, resource constraint, capacity constraint, implementation challenges. But the so what, the challenge that Mo gave us earlier, what's this new vision? And how do we begin to articulate it so that we can see the differences moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much so for all these rich perspectives. I just repeat so that you a little bit can sort yourself, and then I will invite just brief resonance to whatever question you like to resonate. So we had these 4 questions. One was on the resilience of processes. the first one. The second one was a question how far the stakeholders from different TJ and rule of law and so on are talking to each other. The third question was on implementation, and non-implementation to make it to make it more clear. And the fourth question also how to avoid all these non-implementing failures and learnings. Roughly, yeah. So, yeah, maybe we start and move here.
Thank
Fatou.
you. You know, all of those are relevant questions, particularly the one for resilience. And of course, the Gambia being we are not part of the Sahel, but we are very close, and seeing all what's happened to those countries, it's worrying for us. So I don't have the answer for you, but this is something that we are conscious of. Perhaps for us is that there is still the political will. There is still involvement of victims, victim-led organizations, and civil society organizations are on top of, we are basically not letting the government go. We keep writing to them, we keep reminding them, and I think this answers part of, for instance, the reparations bill. When we knew the reparations bill was out, we reviewed it. The things that we felt uncomfortable about, we wrote our papers again. So for us, the TRRC, our consultation haven't stopped, or our engagements for civil society, we continue to advocate for victims' rights. When we look at reparations, we also want to move away from reparations whereas it's looked at monetary payment. We want meaningful reparations where communities are reparated, where memorialization is initiated and other stuff. So we are following, and again, the worry for us too, where is that funding coming from? There is a lot of attention on prosecution, and that right now we have a lot of support and commitment towards prosecuting those who are mentioned, but what we don't have commitment is around reparations. So that's one of the, so thank you.
Okay, so a few reflections in response. I think the resilience question is, I would take it from a few different angles. On one hand, of course, there's at some point there's a limit to what one can do if the political forces in a country align themselves in a way that they return to being repressive, etc. And one has to ask oneself what failed during that process, right? But I think there's a few things. One has to accept the same thing. We had this a bit in the discussion on transformative potential. I said earlier, one has to be also somewhat humble and not overpromise, because it's not a linear process, never, right? And some countries will have more setbacks than others, but they will happen. I mean, on one side, sort of the more hopeful aspect to it is to say, but that also means that sometimes the opportunity that seems to have already been completely lost and closed, like countries that had truth and reconciliation commissions with lots of recommendations, but nobody acted on them. Sierra Leone, Liberia to some extent, and years later, governments change, but people don't forget, and the next generation also doesn't forget and starts to ask questions. And I think we see it in a lot of societies. Germany was the same thing. They didn't start talking about the Second World War Nazi regime in 1946. That took 20 years and more, right? Until that properly started, So in there you have now situations where they're starting to go back to it, but it's a reference point. It's that moment in time that can't be deleted if it was preserved. And there you can think about how do you preserve it, right? There are some countries where these things are particularly volatile, and they do get also copied and preserved elsewhere, and the UN also helps with those kind of things. So if you think that evidence gets lost and reports that were captured, the voices of so many people don't get disseminated, well, you have institutions that can protect them when the time comes, bring them back. And we see that in some countries. El Salvador is a country we're supporting right now with a very particular transitional justice process that is about a commission the country now set up on disappeared people from the civil war from decades ago that never got attention, but now it does, right? So sometimes it's also positive things happen much later after a lot of less. In the meantime, of course, part of my answer would be one has to, what I said a bit earlier and what I hope the new Agenda for Peace will emphasize a lot, this investment in local infrastructures for peace, right? Like how do you think about how communities, when they cannot change what their regime is doing, how do they cope with it during those times, that you don't lose all the capacities of local organization. And I think your examples earlier were also important, the way that we do these processes. Mo perhaps can talk about this much better, but we had discussions about how she also approached her work in the Philippines. And for the international community, I think it's important there to make sure that we are not seen as, the gods in their white vehicles that descend in a moment in time and do run all of these processes in our big white UN vehicles or other colors, whatever it may be. And people think that this all depends just on these outsiders who leave after 2 years because the process is over, and then what, right? So you can do this very differently, and I think all of these things matter to anchor it more and over time make sure that the people that have lived through this, they're also the ones that ultimately they will have to call it back in, right? But the international actors can facilitate or hinder that in the way we behave, right? And what we emphasize. How do we coordinate? So without going into all sorts of UN internal terms, and happy to talk more about it over a drink, it happens both at headquarters and at country level. I think often headquarters has the bigger problem with breaking down silos than at country level. Because we all get so stuck in our institutional mechanisms. On this topic in particular, my main point would be, it happens, but more needs to happen. There is things around that try to improve UN coordination years ago under rule of law. So there's a global rule of law focal point mechanism that brings all UN agencies and departments together that work on this. And at some point, I would say that transitional justice was always considered to be often part of the rule of law agenda. And for me personally, but of course I work in the Peacebuilding and Political Affairs Department and the Peacebuilding Fund. Sure, the transitional justice has to do with the rule of law and reasserting the validity of the law and a human rights-based approach, but it's about so much more than that. It's a little much more linked with peacebuilding. And in fact, in that mechanism, global rule of law, it doesn't appear very much. And transitional justice at the moment doesn't have a standing coordinating mechanism in the UN. So in fact, one of the recommendations coming out of the new Secretary General's guidance note on transitional justice that I hope stands in the final version is to create that specifically for transitional justice so that it gets a more visible, at the minimum some sort of task force that regularly brings the different parts of the system together, because we have expertise in various corners of the system, but they need to be brought together more regularly, in a nutshell. And reparations, briefly on that, is, in my experience, one of the big challenges that when you ask who funds them, where does the money come from, in many contexts, external donors do not want to fund reparations programs because they see this as, but this is now we've supported the processes and the mechanisms and institutions, but this is now about the responsibility and the accountability of the government in question that has to atone and take responsibility. If we are seen to be paying this sends the wrong signal. That's the attitude in a lot of contexts, and there's some rationale to that, right? So for me then the question becomes, well, apart from the fact that in some contexts international actors were also really part of the problem, so there you can have a much more complex discussion about who participated in what way and facilitated sort of certain conflict dynamics, and to what extent does that come out in a national process, and can you make more of an argument that they also need to be held to account and somehow contribute to the conversations, including mechanisms where it is about, just for example, Western countries who have banking centers that held millions of dollars that certain leaders misappropriated from their countries over decades, and that were protected by the banking systems of the West or the North or whatever you want to call it. There are ways to get at this and put this back into reparations programs, right? But that needs a lot of action that goes way beyond what we often discuss in a TJ community, but it's possible, right? So there are ways, I think, to do this, and limitations, and maybe I'll stop there for now. But some reflection.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and you're also here for the reception and you can be approached. Jehan, I don't know if there's one of the questions you like to resonate, otherwise I would have one to you, but if there's one jumping at you, then yes.
Yeah, I just want to answer on that resilience.
Yes, this was one.
In our context, we lived in conflict for 40 years. And I think our resiliency was tested enough.
Yes.
And this time we have the agreement, we have the transition government, and that is what we are maximizing. You know, it's like something is better than nothing. So that's how we are resilient. In terms of resiliency, we really live to the what is in there. But as long as we didn't stop, as long as we are not stopping in working on how we can achieve the lasting peace or the meaningful peace.
Thank you, Jehan, so much. I think this was a very, very nice last word for our round. So one step further and stay to look for the next step. Thank you very, very much for your questions, your attention, and for